Aבדה הארץ. Shloi berchu b'Torah tchila. When Rav Shach Zatzal delved into this sugya, he said it felt like the walls of his house were shaking. Why is that so? We know the famous Maimer Chazal, it's brought down in Maseches Nedorim. Why, for what reason was the land lost? Why was there a churban? Aבדה הארץ. What was the reason? What was the cause of the churban? Dover zeh nishal. This question was nishal. It was nishal to the Chacham. It was nishal to the Nevi'im. It was nishal to the Malachi Asharis. This question was asked to the Nevi'im, to the Chachamim. They didn't have an answer. None of them had an answer. Even the Malachi Asharis, no one had an answer. Until the Rabbi Shalom himself declared, and he said, Al Shaloi Bercha B'Torah Tchila. The reason was because they did not recite Birchas HaTorah. And many questions arise. What does this mean? Because they did not recite Birchas HaTorah. The first question is, this is Aבדה הארץ, as a pasuk in Yirmiyah. And of course, this is referring, Yirmiyah's time was Bayis Rishon. And in Bayis Rishon we know that the Averis in Bayis Rishon were the three Gimel Averis Chamuris, Avodah Zarah, Gilarai, Shrichas Domim, the most terrible Averis. And the Navi is full with it, psukim admonishing Am Yisrael for their terrible ways, for the Avodah Zarah, for the Shrichas Domim, Gilarai. What does it mean? Nobody knew. Aבדה הארץ. Nobody knew. It's full of Averis, left and right. There's bloodshed. There's Avodah Zarah. Aבדה הארץ. And no one could give an answer. And the answer is Birchas HaTorah. And that's the answer is Birchas HaTorah. What do you mean? What do you mean? All of this is Gimel Averis Chamuras. So the Torah's Chaim and other Meforshim explain, and they say, Avada, of course, it was obvious that there were terrible Averis. It was something that was known to all. There were terrible Averis. And the Navi was screaming about the terrible Averis. That wasn't the question. The question was, Aבדה הארץ. This was a land of Torah. This was a land of Hashros HaShechina. There was a Beis HaMikdash. There were Korbanos. There were Tzadikim. There's Nevuah. It was the Malkum of Hashros HaShechina. How did it come to this? How could it come to this, that in this land of Hashros HaShechina, there are these terrible Averis? How could it come to this? How could this happen? So much Torah, so many Tzadikim, Nevi'im, the Beis HaMikdash, Korbanos, Hashros, HaShechina, and this is what they're doing? How could it come to this? Nobody had the answer. Nobody knew. How did this happen? How did this happen? Klal Yisrael, the Am Hashem, Mamlachas, Kohanim, V'goy, Kodesh, in Eretz Yisrael, where the Beis HaMikdash, how could they descend to these terrible low depths? How could they commit these crimes? Which on the surface would mean that they did not recite Birchas HaTorah. But if that's what it means, that they simply did not say Birchas HaTorah, well, why Dafke Birchas HaTorah is that they did not recite? And that should be pretty obvious that there's an aver over here of not reciting Birchas HaTorah. Rabbeinu Yonah explains that there was something missing in their learning of the Torah Lishma. There was something missing in how they were machshav the Torah. how they're makshav limud Torah, in their learning lishma of Torah. The bracha of Birchas Torah shows the chavivus of Torah, the chashivus of Torah, how much we love the Torah. They had Torah, but they weren't makshav it enough. They didn't learn it lishma enough, and therefore they descended to this level, and there was a churban. Rav Shach Zatzal raises a fascinating question. That was the cause of the churban, and Klal Yisrael were punished, and they should have known, and they should have taken steps to remedy it, and they should have done tshuva. Fragt Rav Shach Zatzal, Dover zeh nishal, this question, Alma Avdar, Dover zeh nishal chacham, is nishal neviim, is nishal malachim yeshurts. Nobody had the answer. None of them had the answer. Nobody knew. Nobody knew. It was something that was so dak min hadak. It was something that was so concealed, so hidden, that even the great Chachamim and Nevi'im, even the Malach Yeshurs, nobody knew. So how is Klal Yisrael supposed to know? If the greatest Chachamim and Nevi'im and Malach, nobody knows, only the Rabbi Nishal, how is a Yid supposed to know? How is a Yid supposed to know that there's this terrible Avera, there's this terrible crime that's going to lead to the most Geferlich Zachen? How's a Yid supposed to know? For Rav Shach, there are things that Chachamim don't know. There are things that Nevi'im don't know. And there are even things that Malachim don't know. But a person knows, a person is capable of knowing what's in the depth of his heart. Every Yid has a neshama. A neshama is a chet gelakai mimo. It's nishmas ruach chayim. And that's what the Rebbeinu Shalom breathed into us. And we have a neshama that's a chelek gelakai mimo, and a Yid is capable of knowing about himself, about the depths of his soul, about where he's lacking, about his sincerity, about his motives. A person is capable of knowing about himself what no one else knows. Not even Chachamim, not even everyone. No one else knows. A person is capable of knowing about himself. So there was a tefillah on Klal Yisrael. We can understand with this principle, with this yesod, a parsha in the Torah, Parshas Kairach. Chazal tell us that Kairach was on the greatest level, on the level of Aaron. Kairach was an unbelievable level. He was a godel. And Adas Kairach were the Roshei Ha'am. The Adas Kairach were the Roshei Ha'am. They were on this great, they were the greatest people. And the Medrash tells us that those who joined in were the Rosh Hashanahs, the leaders, the Dayanim, the leaders, the greatest people. They all joined into Kairach, and they all joined into this rebellion. Who rebelled against Moshe and Aaron? It wasn't the lowest people. It was the greatest people. They were part of this rebellion. If that's the case, that there was this terrible machlokes at Moshe and Aaron, but you had the Roshei Ha'am, all the leaders, the greatest people. What is a Yid to do? How is a Yid, a Pashut Yid, what is he supposed to do? There's a machlokes here. What is he supposed to do? How can we ever mon from a Yid that to know the right path and not veer off when there's balei machlokes, not to be involved in machlokes, not to the churban with sinas chinam, machlokes. What is a Yid to do? But there are things that the Chachamim don't know. There are things that the Nevi'im don't know. And even the Malachei Sharas, but Lefi this Yisayid from Rav Shach, we can understand that a Yid knows the depths of his heart. A Yid can know, is capable of knowing where his neshama tahira should be drawn to. What really speaks to his neshama tahira, which really draws him to the Makor HaTaira, to the Rebbeinu Shalom. Every Yid is capable of knowing that about his own neshama, about himself. And the Yidden were capable of knowing. And we're all capable of knowing. Rav Shach wrote that when he delved into this Yisayid about Avedha Haaretz, this Yisayid about the neshama, the chelak Elokai Mimal, and what Chazal is teaching us over here, he says, it appeared to me like the walls of my house were shaking and trembling. It was such a profound Yisayid for Rav Shach, and it penetrated so deeply, it's like the whole wall was shaking, it was tittering. Just to conclude with the famous Maisa, they say over that, I once asked Rav Aaron Zatzal, how do we know who is a Gadol B'Yisrael? There are Talmidei Chachamim, there are different Talmidei Chachamim in different areas. How does Klal Yisrael know who is the Gadol Adayr? How do they know who's the Gadol? And what criteria? How do we base it on? Rav Aaron answered, Klal Yisrael knows who their leaders are. Klal Yisrael knows who their Gadol is. And perhaps we can understand it in that manner. Every Yid has a neshama that can comprehend, perceive things that no one else can. And he can perceive the emes, which is negayah to him. There's a collective neshama for Klal Yisrael. There's a collective neshama for Klal Yisrael, where Klal Yisrael as a nation, as an ummah, can perceive what's good and right and proper for Klal Yisrael. What's necessary is that we have to have the right desire. We have to have the ratzon, we have to have want, and we have to desire for what's good and what's right and kodesh and Torah. And if we do, the Rebbeinu Shalom will illuminate our eyes.